Hey guys, welcome to Built. I'm Billy, and today we're going to be changing out the clutch on my 2000 Honda Civic. Hey everyone, welcome to the garage. If you've been watching some of my other videos, welcome back. If you are a subscriber, welcome back. But if you're new, go ahead and take this opportunity to go back and check out some of my old videos if you want to get up to date on some of my current projects as well as some of the older content that I've released. Also, I'll go ahead and drop a link below to my social media. If you're interested in this video and you want to stay more up to date on some of my projects, social media, particularly Instagram, is a better way to get more day-to-day updates since shooting and editing these videos can take some time. Alright guys, so if you've been following along, or at least if you've seen my most recent video, then you'll know that I recently picked up this new to me 2000 Honda Civic EX. Now this car is a 5-speed manual, and in that last video I do mention that one of the things I do want to change is the clutch. Now, I've been driving the car for a few weeks and it is starting to slip a little bit and it generally just doesn't feel the way that I want, so I felt that there's no time like the present, so I'd go ahead and get this clutch replaced. Now, if you follow along in this video, I'm going to go over all the parts that I ordered, as well as some other things that you might want to change while you're in there, as well as all the tools and all the steps that you're going to need if you want to replace a clutch like this. So first things first, let's go ahead and discuss the actual parts that we're going to need to go ahead and start this repair. Now, the first things that we're going to want to look at is the actual clutch friction disc itself, number 4, and the pressure plate, number 5. Now, these two items generally come together. If you're like me and you want to go aftermarket, they will come as a set. When you look at the factory diagram like so, you're going to see that they're actually broken down into separate pieces. However, like I said, I decided to go with an aftermarket and bought them together. So the next piece we're going to want to talk about is the flywheel. Now, the flywheel doesn't have to be replaced. It's always recommended that it gets resurfaced, but it doesn't necessarily have to be replaced. But I figured while I was in here, I was going to go ahead and replace my flywheel, which you can see is number 3, as well as the pilot bearing, which is indicated as number 12. Now, I also went with aftermarket for this, and the pilot bearing was included. So once again, it's another thing that it comes as a set, and I didn't have to do it piece by piece, although you can see that you can buy them individually. Now, the last thing I'm going to touch on is the hardware. Now, you can see number 8 and number 10, which are the bolts that hold the flywheel to the crank and the pressure plate to the flywheel. Now, I decided to go ahead and go with new hardware. I just figured since I was in here, I wanted to just go ahead and replace everything. It's a little bit extra cost, but it is something that I do feel better about replacing. Now, the last thing I want to mention is some of the engine seals. Now, you can see oil pans and axle seals and stuff like that, but the number one thing that I suggest replacing is actually number 27 here, and that is the Rea Main Seal. Now, the Rea Main Seal is really only accessible when you have the flywheel off, so I find it absolutely imperative to at least inspect it and at least plan to replace it. Now, if it's not leaking at all, then you can go ahead and leave it, but I always suggest replacing it when doing a clutch job. Now let's go ahead and talk about some tools. Now the first thing I want to talk about is this set of sockets. Now generally a mechanic set will work because you're going to need a 10, 12, 14, 17, 19, and 32 millimeter sockets. Now the 32 is the one that's most likely to not be in a general mechanic set, and you're going to need that for your spindle nut. Now you'll also notice that I like to use a multitude of drives, everything from 1/4 inch, 3/8, 1/2 inch, as well as multiple extensions to make sure I get the job done. Now, a good set of combo wrenches or box wrenches is always helpful, but not necessarily needed for this job, as well as a good set of a couple hammers and this 8mm punch, which is very specific to take out the pin for your shifter. Now, I also like to use a set of standard screwdrivers as well as pliers, and I always recommend at least a 1/2 inch breaker bar. 3/8 is nice, and a full set of pry bars will help you get the job done. Now, the first specialty tool is really this ball joint separator. I went a long time without it, and now that I have it, I have no idea why I never bought one in the first place, and I love using it. Now, the most important thing is always going to be to have a torque wrench, and make sure that it's sized appropriately depending on the torque specs that you need. So I felt like the best way to do this video would be to compare and contrast the way that I would do this as a DIY job versus how I would do it if I was following the factory service manual. And the best place to start is really to outline the major steps of the process. So in order to replace the clutch, first things first, you have to remove the transmission, which according to the factory service manual is broken down into about 17 steps, which mostly involves removing all the peripherals like sensor wiring, the clutch slave cylinder, as well as the driveline, particularly in this case the CV joints. So the factory service manual outlines the first couple of steps as basically removing a lot of the peripherals, disconnecting the battery terminal, removing the air intake tube, disconnecting the starter, transmission ground wires, and backup light switch connector, as well as the vehicle speed sensor. Now I won't go into removing the airbox in painstaking detail, but basically it's a couple of 10mm bolts, some ring clamps, as well as removing a hose and a sensor. After removing the airbox, I felt like it was a good time to remove the transmission to chassis ground, as is outlined in step 4. So step 7 outlines removing the clutch slave cylinder assembly, which is ultimately just the removal of these two 12mm bolts on the side of the assembly. This allows us to move back up top and continue to remove the rest of the lines and brackets as outlined in step 7. So I do go ahead and take this time to remove the battery terminal as well as start on the starter motor, which these two 14mm mounting bolts were actually two of the tightest bolts that I found in the entire car, and I don't actually complete pulling the starter during this filming session because I do smash my knuckles on the firewall. Now, one of the steps that you may have noticed that I skipped is this step number 2 in the factory service manual, which is draining the transmission oil. Now, draining the transmission oil is fairly simple, and one of the things I always suggest is to remove the filler plug first. Now, you never want to be in a situation where you've already drained the fluid, and now you have a problem with the filler plug, and you can't put fluid back into the transmission. So to sum it up, basically you want to open the fill plug, remove the drain plug, allow your fluid to come out, and then close everything back up. So the next step in the factory service manual, step 8, is removing the drive shafts. So these come with their own separate set of removal instructions, which I will go over step by step, which this is really one of the more complicated processes of this whole job. So the first few steps are fairly straightforward, but you'll actually notice that while I take the wheel off, I do actually put it back on without the center cap, and that's so that I have access to the spindle nut, which I can then loosen on the ground and use the tire itself to hold everything in place. Now, this is actually where my DIY technique starts to differ pretty substantially from the factory service manual. Now, the factory service manual does call for removing the lower fork completely from the strut, and to be honest, that's probably a lot easier than what I did, but I wanted to be a little bit adventurous and go ahead and try to use the upper ball joint as my release point to see if I can remove the axles adequately. So this process did end up working, and I really didn't have any issues with it, but ultimately I do think the other one's easier, and I used it for both sides, but it did render steps 8, 9, and 10 all but useless. Now, unfortunately, I didn't really get a good visual of actually removing the axle from the transmission, but you can see in steps 11 and 12, and even 13, that it pretty clearly outlines in the factory service manual how to remove these from the transmission and the knuckle. With the axles removed, we can return back to the transmission removal instructions from the factory service manual, which brings us to step 9, which step 9 is removing the exhaust, which I actually decided to skip since it really only affects step 11, which is removing the engine stiffeners and clutch cover, which I was able to remove those on their own. The trick was that I had to leave the cover in until I removed the transmission, which of course meant when I reinstalled the transmission, the cover would have to be in already. Now the next step, or step 10, is to remove the shift linkage, which is made up of the linkage itself and a stabilizer bar. Now the stabilizer bar is just bolted in, which is pretty straightforward, but the linkage is held together by a roll pin. This is where that 8mm punch comes in, and it should be pretty straightforward. However, I did not have the proper tools at the time, so I did end up having to take the pin out after I removed the transmission, which is less than ideal, but it worked just fine. So the next steps, 12 and 13, outline supporting the engine, which I'll do later in the video, and removing the splash guard, which you can see here. So step 14 outlines removing the right front mount bracket, also known as the torque mount, which is pretty much straightforward, and it's 3 bolts that go into the transmission and 1 bolt that goes through the chassis mount. So here's where I'm going to start jumping around a little bit, jumping here to step 18. This is where I'm going to go ahead and take out all of the rear mounts, bolts, as well as anything that's underneath the car so that I can place my jack and get back on top for final removal. Alright guys, so here's another step where I'm going to backtrack a little bit, moving back to 17, and I'm going to go ahead and prep the top 4 bolts for removal. This includes the back starter mounting bolt, as well as the 3 front transmission mounting bolt. Now it's time for steps 15 and 16, placing the jack, as well as removing the transmission mount and bracket. With the mount bracket removed, it's now time for step 19, which is removing the transmission. Clutch removal is going to be pretty straightforward. The pressure plate is held on by 6 10mm 12-point bolts, which will require a 12-point socket. The flywheel is pretty much the same way. It is 6 17mm 12-point bolts. Now, one trick for easy removal of the rear main seal is to use a screw to give yourself a leverage point. Just make sure to not hit any of the metal surrounding the sealing surface. So now that everything's removed, it's a good time to go over all the things that we're actually going to replace when we're doing this job. Now, obviously the clutch and the flywheel are going to get replaced, but also we want to focus on the rear main seal, the throw-out bearing, and the pilot bearing. The installation of the rear main seal is basically the opposite of removal. Now, basically you can just kind of push it into place, and in this case I used a hammer and a punch to give it a little bit of pressure to get it all the way flush to the mating surface. So one thing I do want to outline is basically removing and installing a new pilot bearing, or in this case just installing the new pilot bearing as shown on the side of the screen here before installing the flywheel. Now, once again, installing the flywheel is the opposite of removal, and I do suggest getting some sort of ring gear holder. I opted for the bolt and pry bar method, but I've seen people use the crank bolt. Ultimately, the bottom line is as long as you can get your 87 foot-pounds of torque on each bolt, then you should have it installed properly. After cleaning the face of the flywheel, install the clutch disc with the installation tool, and then install the pressure plate. Now, the pressure plate is held on with 6 12-point 10mm bolts. Each are going to be torqued to 19 foot-pounds, and be sure to note the specific star-shaped pattern that's called out for torquing these bolts. Now, one last thing I wanted to do before we got everything back into the car was go ahead and give this transmission housing a good clean. Now, I'm not so much worried about it from an aesthetic point of view, but the amount of grease that was inside this bell housing can be detrimental to the way that the clutch and flywheel operate. Now, the last step before reinstalling everything that we took out for this process is to install the release bearing. Now, the release bearing is pretty straightforward and it installs on the shift fork as shown in the diagram on the right. Now, once again, reinstallation is pretty much just the opposite of removal. I did try to get the transmission in on my own, but ultimately I was not successful. I did require an extra set of hands, but I did eventually get the transmission in and seated properly. So the rest of the job from here is basically just paying attention to torque specs and your order of operations, which in this case is installing the transmission, getting it bolted on, attaching all your peripherals, and then installing the axles and topping off the fluid. For this rest of the video, I'll try to kind of gloss over everything with posting some of the notes and torque specs on the screen here, but ultimately I'm not going to go into great detail about everything going back together, as it really is just the opposite of the way it came apart. When installing the CV joint, you want to make sure that your set ring clicks in as shown on the diagram here to the right. The rest of the drive shaft install should go the same as it was removed, installing the lower ball joint and the lower fork. One of the last major considerations is going to be the installation of the spindle nut. Now, you're going to notice here that you're going to want to stake the spindle nut against the axle. The final steps will be to top off your fluid, reassemble your airbox, and of course, don't forget to torque your lug nuts. Alright guys, I'm going to go ahead and take this opportunity to wrap up this video. So thanks again to everyone who watched and all the subscribers out there. Anybody who liked what they saw, go ahead and hit that like button, hit subscribe so you can stay tuned for more DIY content on this car or even some of my other project builds. You can follow along. Like I said, link to Instagram below. That's the best way for daily updates. And go ahead and leave me a comment if you have any feedback. I try to respond as best I can to that, and I always try to use that to make bigger and better videos for you guys out there. So once again, like always, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and catch you in the next video.